Welcome. I am Bunny Ellerin, the co-president of the HBS Healthcare Alumni Association, as well as the CEO of DHNY, and we are delighted to welcome you to our VRT. I want to introduce our two panelists. First, we've got Dr. Errol Pierre, who is a healthcare executive, public speaker, professor, and author. He is currently the Senior VP of State Programs at Healthfirst, which, as a New Yorker, I know is the largest nonprofit health plan. Previously, he was COO at Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield. Dr. Pierre graduated from Fordham University with a bachelor's in business administration. He also has a master's in health policy and financial management from NYU and a PhD in business from Baruch. And he is a proud AMP graduate of Harvard Business School. He's also an adjunct professor at NYU, Columbia, and Baruch. And of course, he's the author of the book that we'll be talking about today, The Way Up, Climbing the Corporate Mountain as a Professional of Color. Joining Dr. Pierre is Dr. Sachin Jain, who is the CEO of Scan Group and Scan Health Plan, one of the largest not-for-profit Medicare Advantage plans. Previously, Dr. Jain was president and CEO of CareMore and Aspire Health, and he has also served as CMIO and Innovation Officer at Merck, as well as Senior Advisor to the Administrator for CMS, as we know, Center for Medicare and Medicaid. Dr. Jain is a triple Harvard grad. He's a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College. He has both his MD and MBA from Harvard. And he's an adjunct professor on the other side of the country, Stanford. And he is, I read him all the time on Forbes. He's an amazing columnist. He writes phenomenal posts, so you should read them. And he's always on the 100 most influential people in US healthcare. So without further ado, I bring you both of these very esteemed panelists who are going to have a great discussion, and I look forward to it. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Bunny.
Thank you, Bunny. An amazing introduction. And Dr. Jain, I'm happy to see you today. Thanks for joining. I think we're going to have a great conversation. So let me do an intro. I wrote The Way Up, which is a book that's out now as a roadmap to guide others as they pursue their personal and professional dreams and aspirations through this maze we call corporate America. This afternoon, I feel very fortunate that we have the amazing opportunity to hear from Sachin Jain, a remarkable individual that is prominently featured in The Way Up through a series of quotes that provide much rich nuggets of information. He was very vulnerable, and he added lots of clarity to some of the questions that professionals of color may be asking as they pursue their career. So happy to have this dialogue because he was one of the folks that I was able to interview for the book. So Dr. Jain, my first question, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Well, and thank you, Errol, and thanks for writing the book. I think it's a really, really important book, and I think you address a lot of topics that I think many of us think about, many of us talk about, but very few actually put pen to paper on. So just want to say thank you for your very important contribution.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I had nothing else to do during the pandemic, so I appreciate it. So let's jump right in. During our interview, because I did get to interview 11 executives of color, and I'm, again, thankful that you said yes. One of the things that we talked about was the parallels between your way up and mine. And so as we start this afternoon, would you mind sharing with everyone that's on the call your purpose and your passion for being in healthcare? I strongly believe that people should think about their purposes and passion. So why did you decide to go into healthcare as a lifelong career?
Yeah, so I grew up in northern New Jersey. I was the first in my family to be born in this country. My father came here as a young physician and sought training, and like a lot of, I think, Indian immigrant physicians, wanted all of his kids to be doctors, and so I think, but also wanted to give us the space and room to kind of do what we were passionate about. So I joke with folks. When I came home for Thanksgiving in my freshman year of college, I said, "Dad, I think I might want to be a lawyer." He said, "You should become a lawyer after you become a doctor." So it was, kind of always a part of my family story. We have a number of people in our family who are involved in healthcare in different formats. But as I started to get interested in healthcare and engaged in healthcare, one of the things that really struck me was the, I think, very deep inequities that I observed, and some of the challenges that we have in actually, delivering care to people in this country. And the big healthcare policy story when I was in college was the number of, the tens of millions of Americans who didn't necessarily have access to coverage. Of course, that landscape has changed a little bit, but in many ways, the deeper issues that I think, that those statistics, tens of millions of Americans, without insurance represent, still exist in our system today. Yep. And so I think I would say my purpose and my passion is really around trying to create a more equitable and just health system. Recognizing that no matter who you are, whether you're a rich Manhattanite or you're or sort of a middle class person in Southern California, we all have serious challenges accessing healthcare in America right now. And so I think we need a reboot of the system, and so that's kind of been my purpose. I'm more optimistic than I have been in a while that we might be able to get to that kind of reboot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very along the same lines, same thing. Parents came to America, was quickly observing disparities in healthcare, which led to my passion to pursue. And so it sounds like the history of your parents, absolutely had a strong hold on what you want to be. One of the reasons I went back to school for my doctorate was the same thing as your parents. They said, yeah, you still need to be a doctor. They didn't say what kind, which is why I went the writing paper route, but great to hear. So let's jump in. Second chapter of the book revolves around embracing your defining moments. You alluded to your parents earlier. That chapter really focuses on finding your roots. And you describe vividly in quotes, which so many people reached out and said, the thoughts that you had in the book were so compelling. You describe watching your parents come to America from India, as you mentioned, feeling a sense of responsibility to validate the sacrifices they made by moving to a new country. Can you elaborate some more on that? I know you touched on it, but
yeah, I mean, Errol, I increasingly think of immigration as a unrecognized traumatic event in the lives of people. It is incredibly traumatic. It was, particularly at the time in which my parents came and your parents came to, leave a comfortable homeland, leave your parents, leave your siblings, leave, your extended family, leave everything that you're comfortable with, not even speak the language very well, get on a plane and start anew, with an eye towards progress. And, I think about the fact that, my dad didn't get to see his mother before she passed away. I think about the fact that my mother didn't get to see her father before he passed away. The fact that there was just so many moments in their lives that were defined, by their desire to give us more opportunity, more economic opportunity, more, personal freedom. And, I think with that comes this burden, the sense of burden that you've got to make it count, that, you've got to make those sacrifices feel like they were worth something. And so I think that creates some of the ambition and the drive that I think is so common among people of color, immigrants to this country, is wanting to validate some of those hard choices that our family members made to give us a better life and a better opportunity. And so that was always in the background. The lesson I got from my dad kind of growing, he was very successful in his own ways, in his, in an academic medical career. But I would say, like, the expectation was always that you have to exceed your dad, which is kind of a weird thing. My dad started the pain service at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So like the bar was pretty high. Yeah. But, I think it was never about, hey, be happy, right? I'm sure it was the same for you, Errol. It was like, oh, that came later. That kind of coaching and guidance from them came later. But it wasn't like, oh, when you were a student or in elementary school or high school or college, where we were optimizing for our happiness. We were optimizing for success, for impact, for, being able to be in a position where you could actually make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. If I can probe too, how did you balance that pressure and so that responsibility with ensuring that you're actually going to do something that you enjoy? I don't know if you can share.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my pathway into management of organizations, health policy, kind of really drew from my more instinctual interests. I was the kid who watched Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw with my dad every night and talked about the news. And so, issues related to public policy, politics were always kind of near and dear to my heart. And I kind of saw a natural fit between a career. It took a while to see it, but a career in healthcare and medicine. And, healthcare is one of the most important social issues of our time. I was able to make that leap, but it took a few mentors along the way, quite a few mentors along the way for me to really crystallize that vision, Errol. And I was lucky. I mean, throughout my time as an undergraduate medical student in business school, I always had mentors who kind of were guiding me towards higher and broader impact. That image changed over time. I think I thought when I started out that I would be a health services researcher writing papers on the health system because I thought that would change the health system. Over time, I wanted to work in policy and politics, got to do that for a couple of years in the Obama administration. And then over time realized that management of organizations was going to be the most fulfilling thing for me. And so that's kind of how I found my way into my executive career, first at Merck, and then subsequently at, CareMore at Anthem, where we met. And then, subsequently now, at SCAN, where I've now led the organization for 3 years.
That's great. And you're still involved in policy in your role, and you're still writing. So you kind of all put it together.
Yeah, I would say some of the best advice I ever got from my dad was it's kind of been life defining for me, is learn to write. He said, in order to be taken seriously in any field, you have to be able to express yourself. And so, he really wanted me to be a good writer. And so I took a lot of classes where I had to write a lot of papers in college, and kind of forced myself to write as much as I could. And now it's something, believe it or not, that I do for fun, which is kind of funny to say at this point in my life.
Yeah, I hear you. Let's move to chapter 8. And in that chapter, I go into some detail about a concept called double consciousness. It's a phrase coined by W.E.B. Du Bois from the book he wrote in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folk. It describes feeling a two-ness as an American, but also as someone who is underrepresented or marginalized. W.E.B. Du Bois describes vividly as two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body. That's sort of how he describes it. It was interesting because without knowing what you would say in the interview, and I already had this chapter written, you also vividly describe similar parallels in being an executive in corporate America who also happens to be a minority, calling it two conflicting identities. So I immediately put the two in parallels together. Specifically, you said in the book, you're not only a CEO, but you're also an Indian American CEO. You have to bear the simultaneous weight of the job, but also of being a representative of a community. Can you just speak to more of that double consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, look, the two-ness shows up in so many different ways. And the earliest childhood memories of the two-ness are, you're not a third grader, you're an Indian third grader, and you're a representative of your race, and you carry all the burden of having to answer everyone's questions about the Taj Mahal and what you're eating for lunch and why it's different and why you're a vegetarian and why your God has 10 faces. And I mean, that's a big part of your identity growing up, particularly, in New Jersey in the 80s before, Indians kind of took over New Jersey as some people kind of have observed. But what I would say is, since then, I've had a number of experiences where your identity just shows up. And I think I told you the story of how when I was at a big, corporate meeting, when, my peers all said, oh, I don't really understand what that person's saying. They've got a really thick accent, and they were speaking super clear English. And it was, kind of a gratuitous comment, something that I felt like I needed to take action on, because, in some ways I'm not just, an executive, but I'm also an Indian executive. And that kind of commentary felt super ignorant. There was the time where I was accused of hiring too many Indian doctors. And I thought about the fact that, if I were white and I were hiring white doctors, no one would accuse me of hiring too many white doctors. But because we look different, and we're minorities, that becomes a question. I think about the fact that even now, as we struggle with questions of like what is diversity, and even as more and more Indian Americans are becoming leaders of organizations, we increasingly hear reports of people saying, "Well, you're Indian, you're not diverse," and it's a complete dismissal of all of the kind of different experiences we've had as people in this country, and some of the kind of failings of actually operating as a model, quote unquote, model minority in this country. So I just think we all have two-ness. I think Du Bois was absolutely right, and I think we have to acknowledge it, own it, talk about it. And one of the things I've tried to do with both my kind of CEO persona as well as my kind of persona, public persona, is to wear it and kind of not run from it, not hide from it, because because I think so many people struggle with this question of how do I simultaneously operate in the corporate workplace as myself, but also as a member of a community. And I think one of the people I really admire and I see as a role model in this regard is Anish Chopra. Some of you know him. He works in healthcare. He was the chief technology officer in the Obama White House. And I'll always remember, meeting him for the first time. And he doesn't say, "Hello, I'm Anish." He says, "Hey, brother, who are you? Where are you from? Where are your people from? I'm Punjabi, you're Rajasthani." And I'm, surrounded by a group of people literally at the White House who are all kind of looking at these two crazy guys having this like very New Jersey Indian conversation. And he normalized it and he made it comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with actually kind of letting people know who you are and where you're from and what you're about. But so often the kind of implicit corporate code is that you're going to just kind of conform to the dominant culture and leave your identity completely out. And in some way, we kind of lessen ourselves when we do that. And so I would say it's been an evolution. And it's something I've, forced myself to get more comfortable with. And I think it's a little bit atypical, but I also think it's super important for us to allow people to express their identities, whatever they are, in the workplace.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing that example, because I think it provides something vivid and tangible for people to actually wrap their heads around what it looks like. I agree with you 100%. Working at a nonprofit in New York, where we have 1.9 million members, the vast majority are Medicaid eligible, I have to remind people every day. I was like, do you know India is 1 billion people, if not more? Like America's 330 million people. So we can't just treat them as a monolith, right? So I appreciate that. And this is actually continuing on the conversation. So usually when we describe hardship in climbing the corporate mountain as professional color, it can easily be assumed that we're referring to incidents of bias or discrimination perpetrated by people who do not look like us, right? As we just talked about. However, in our discussions during our interview, one of your most challenging situations was actually with another executive from a similar background. And so this was, I think, important for the dialogue and for the book, and I'm glad that you shared it. It just goes to show you that all humans have bias and that the issue is bigger than just gender or race. And so under the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, would you mind sharing that story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think in order for the story to make sense for a kind of a broader audience, it's important to kind of talk a little bit about what it's like to grow up kind of an Indian American, in a kind of a relatively non-diverse community, which is that growing up, your parents don't ask you about how Errol's grades are. They want to know how Amit's grades are, or Pranav's grades are, or Devika's grades are. And so there's this like weird, kind of zero-sumness. And I think it roots back to just how much competition people felt in India, where opportunities were scarce and you felt like your only competition was your own kind. And so I feel like there's a highly competitive dynamic that sometimes emerges among people of the same race, particularly, when there's not that many of you around. Yeah. And the experience I shared with you was about having a boss who was Indian American, who in some ways I think was very threatened by the fact that he was a physician, I was a physician, we were both Indian Americans, and it got so weird and toxic to the point where, he once had his chief of staff call me and say, we'd like you to withdraw from X, Y, and Z awards or recognition program because only one person from the company should get the award or recognition. And, I certainly believe that, our shared identity played into some of the sense of competition he felt for me as a boss. Whereas I actually, when he was appointed, I was excited that I would have somebody who might kind of understand me in a different way than I think previous bosses had. And so I think we tend to sometimes see representation as being a purely good thing by itself, not recognizing that, in the real world of representation, it actually creates a lot of kind of unexpected, unintended dynamics. Sometimes people who you would think would be natural collaborators or competitors, and will go out of their way to actually, get in the way of your progress.
Yeah, I think it's important too, because it speaks to having a scarcity mindset. So you sometimes in corporate America, you can get to these roles where they're sort of token. And so like, oh, this is the person of color role. And people can have the perception of, if there only can be one, I have to make sure I am the one. I don't want anyone else to come behind, versus thinking with, abundancy mindset and say, we can have more seats at the table. We should grow a path for other people.
No, that's exactly right. And actually, kind of having explained the dynamic that I described, I think, this childhood dynamic of like, oh, there can only be one. I remember when I got into Harvard, there was I was in line with a fellow high school student who was also Indian who got into Harvard. And then we're meeting with a third kid who was from Long Island. We were from New Jersey. And he says, the two of you went to the same high school. Impossible. How did the both of you get in? Because in his mind, it was kind of like there was going to be one Indian kid from one high school who was going to get in. So that is what gets coded. What I can say is that, kind of years later, looking in the healthcare industry with as many Indian Americans as there are, I think a lot of times people approach each other or view each other with that sense of competition. Like, who is this guy? Or, a sense of like, there can only be one, Indian American Surgeon General. And why isn't it me? And instead of Vivek Murthy, who's a good friend. And actually around the time that Vivek Murthy was named Surgeon General for the first time, during the Obama administration, I was actually shocked to see how many Indian Americans were vocally negative about him. Oh, he's not a surgeon. Oh, he's not, he's just a hospitalist. Oh, he only practices medicine this amount of time. As opposed to looking and saying, how do we celebrate someone from our community? And so I actually started a group called the South Asian Healthcare Leadership Forum, which was to bring together, men and women, South Asian Americans who work in healthcare, just to get to know each other. It was completely a social meeting to talk about kind of shared identity and some of the shared challenges we experience in the workplace. And what I can tell you is it kind of melted away a lot of the competitive energy that existed between people, and people started to self-reflect for the first time on why they were feeling this way. And so again, I think there's deliberate things we can do with each other and for each other to bring down some of those competitive energies that otherwise are kind of naturally bred into us from an early age.
Yeah. Amazing. And thanks for taking that initiative to set that up. It tears down walls, which is appreciated.
Thanks. Yeah.
So let's talk healthcare. I'm going to brag on SCAN a little bit. You run a top-notch Medicare Advantage plan, coveted, rated 4.5 stars, 6 years straight, very high customer satisfaction ratings, 91%, if not higher, highest in the areas that you serve. You keep innovation at the forefront, continue to expand. So the question really is, as CEO, how do you drive innovation while balancing reinvestment into core capabilities and navigating, obviously, the complexities of the MA program, especially what we're just going through right now with the change in risk scores, change in RADV. I mean, there's a lot of things happening that's changing for next year. So that's the first question on balancing reinvestment and innovation. And then also, if you can fit in, is the long answer, your definition of leadership, because I loved the definition you gave in the book.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think what I would say on the first one, which is like balancing operations and innovation, I think, it's being ultra clear about who you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the truth is that we, like, healthcare, managed care in particular, is super competitive, Errol. Like if you don't have an edge, you're not going to exist in 10 years or 12 years. And so I think we have a lot of self-satisfied organizations that in our industry that are comfortable like doing, talking more and doing less. And so a lot of what, we're focused on is trying to build a culture of genuine execution, genuine innovation, really holding our own feet to the fire around like delivering what it is that our members need. And so that's how we ended up launching, our first, the first LGBTQ plus plan in the country. It's how we grew over $1 billion in revenues over the last 3 years and 60,000 new members. It's how we launched 4 new medical groups. So again, I think it's, taking a true outside-in view and realizing that unless we innovate, all of our organizations are going to die. I mean, what we do in our core business is not so complicated that that unless you have differentiation, you're going to be squeezed out of the market by bigger and, deeper pocketed competitors. So, I think a lot of it is just culture. I think leadership, I don't remember exactly what I said in the book. These days, what I would say it is really kind of getting an extra 10, 20, 30, 40% from the people in your employ, and doing it in a way that they feel inspired and excited to deliver more and give more. And I think in order to do that, you need to spend a lot of time setting a common understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. I've worked with executive coaches on and off for the last number of years, and it all comes down to one major lesson, which is like the need to over communicate vision and purpose to people, because oftentimes they're hearing different messages from a lot of places, and they're in the absence of communications, a lot of people assume the worst. That's just how some people are wired. And so a big part of what we're trying to do is just create a destination for the best talent in the industry to want to come work and challenge, a broken status quo in healthcare.
Yeah. And in particular, are there things you're thinking about strategically, not to give away secret sauce, but in terms of MA over the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah. Look, we have to do more with less, which means we have to get scale. And I would say, part of the reason we are combining with Care Oregon to form the Health Right Group is, I think, the regional not-for-profit health plans, I think, are going to come under attack, by the big nationals on one side and by private equity and investor-backed companies on the other side. And so, we have to begin to achieve scale so that we can, invest more in benefits to serve members. I think we've had a really good run for the last number of years because, the risk model has been generous. I think it's enabled us to, field benefits that have driven the growth of MA. But now with, cuts to the risk model and expected overall cuts to MA revenue in real terms over the next couple of years, I think we got to find ways to do more with less. That's the fundamental challenge of the industry. And I think it's the right challenge. I mean, we have 18% of our national GDP that's actually tied up in healthcare, and everyone is parroting that they want value-based care, but no one has yet said like how we might be able to shrink that 18% to a lower number. And, I believe we should set a national target of 15%, in the next 3 years. How do we do that? I mean, it's going to require significant re-engineering of, the managed care industry as well as the healthcare delivery industry.
Yeah. And on the regional piece, which I'm glad you brought up, it was interesting to see Kaiser's move, with their acquisition on the East Coast. Obviously, your move with Oregon and regional plans, like you said, competing with deep-pocketed for-profit plans with lots of reach. The question always becomes, what are other innovations? Because I think they play a role. I think healthcare is local. And so like what other things should they be focused on just to make sure that they stay ahead of the curve and are able to compete?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Errol, you're kind of just as familiar as I am with what I call the kind of managed care journeyman life cycle. Year one, come to a new job, blame the person who came before you. Year two, try to do the thing you said you were going to do. And year three, start looking for a new job. And that is a dominant leadership model inside of these large national managed care companies. And I would say the regional plans have a really strong benefit, which is that, we have people who are typically in their seats for a bit longer. They're thinking a bit longer term. They're in the community, so they have a deep understanding of the local area considerations and constraints. And so again, I think building the deep connective tissue between plan organizations, provider organizations, is going to be a winning strategy long term. But we have to be aware of the economic realities that, we're competing against entities that have 40, 50 million members, that have that kind of purchasing power with vendors, with PBMs. And so we need our own solution. And so that's why I think organizations like Healthfirst and Scan and, other like-minded, high-performing, regional plans, Care Oregon, should find ways to come together to collaborate to do more with less.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And we would not be here if not for Bunny, who brought us together. So let's also make sure we talk about digital health in light of the organization she runs. So I love the Digital Health New York reports that come out. Her last one, she specifically talked about an uptick in funding for startups, despite the fact that interest rates has gone up. So it's $1 billion in 29 different companies. This is specific to New York, which was on par with what they saw in Q2 of 2022. And then the funding has been in biotech, farm tech, and provider enablement. And obviously there's been a big expansion of provider enablement with all the different vendors that you hear, like Landmark and all the Oak Street and all the others. So real question for you is, what do you see happening in the market around digital health? What should be the focus, especially for MA plans, and any advice for founders? Because I know there's some founders on the call, or CEO startups over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is trying to preserve funding and preserve runway, and hoping the capital markets kind of return to where they were before. I'm not sure that it's going to happen. And so my advice to everyone is to play offense on creative strategic alliances and M&A activities, and play from a position of strength as opposed to a position of weakness. I'm seeing a number of companies that are trying to play from a position, who are now playing from a position of weakness, and are scrambling a little bit to find strategic destinations for their customer relationships, for their IP, for their products. I think in some ways it's because they're not necessarily aligning with where the market is today. They're living in 2018 and 2019 valuations and logic. And so, my advice would be to kind of ground yourself firmly in where we are in 2023. We've got, cost of capital is really high. We're trying to extend runway. The war for talent has slowed down a little bit because there are just, a bit fewer jobs. Everyone's turning away from digital health and services to just AI and AI enablement. And so I'd like to see a lot of creative combinations of subscale companies to have 1 + 1 = 3. There's lots of companies that are basically cousins of each other. I mean, there's 20 behavioral health companies. There's 20 chronic disease management companies that focus on the MA space. We don't need that many. We probably need 3 to 5 in each category. And so I would say, rather than waiting for others to come for you, there's an old adage in M&A, which is companies are bought, not sold. I'm not sure I necessarily believe that. So I think thinking about, what is your strategic destiny, can really help enable the kind of future that where we have strong companies in the space.
Yeah. You echo the same things I've heard at the Vive conference, the Health Vive conference that was in Nashville a month ago. One of the speakers said, look around the table. If you're a startup, get to know who you're next to, because over the next couple of years, you're probably going to have to consider acquisitions, mergers, or partnerships, because we can't have, like you said, 20 different telehealth companies trying to do all the same thing. So I appreciate those comments. I will pause to ask folks to feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as we wrap up. Earlier on, you mentioned mentors, and then you also talked about executive coaches. Just in terms of tools in the tool belt that you can speak to that has helped you on your leadership path and your path to become an executive, other things that are helpful.
Yeah, I think the most significant thing that I realize now, as I kind of, deep, far and long in my own mentoring journey, is the sort of false confidence of youth, which can be like this incredible, can kind of project people to do incredible things that they didn't know that they could do. but also sometimes like leaves you with great blind spots. And I can say, just reflecting on myself, when I was like 29 or 30, I kind of thought of myself as omnipotent and omniscient, and I didn't wear it quite as obnoxiously as I'm describing it, but I did have a strong sense of belief, probably not unlike political candidates who have no experience, who are like, I'm going to run for president before I've run anything. And you kind of look at that, you say, I remember feeling like that. And I would say the biggest thing you can do is just to kind of do work on trying to identify your blind spots. And we all have them, whether it's, kind of a lack of awareness of what our own blind spots are, that is a blind spot in itself, or, specific kind of ideas around people, leadership, operations, strategy, technology, and just continue to work to identify what those are, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to actually enable you to become better, is actually like saying out loud what it is that you're not necessarily good at. And, just to be vulnerable, I can say, like, one of the things I've most recently become aware of is just acknowledging to myself that the style by which I'm motivated isn't necessarily the style that's going to motivate others. I like an intense, hard driving coach on top of me telling me, hey, do more, be more, see more, like a lot of immigrant kids probably. And, for years, my leadership style could probably be best described as kind of emotionally engaged. Like, you would not just hear what wasn't necessarily going well, but you'd also feel it from me. And I think that, as I've kind of, elevated into higher roles of authority, I realized that the position itself in some ways kind of carries all the authority and emotional that I need. So when I present messages, feedback, adopting a more unemotional style, I think has helped me a lot in terms of, kind of connecting and making sure people are focusing on my message and not focusing on my emotion. And so again, I think these are just things that you can kind of consistently work on, forever, and having that kind of vulnerability with yourself. There's a lot of pressure in a job like this to feel like you need to have all the answers, and kind of resisting that temptation, I think, ends up being, wildly trust building with the teams and people that you end up working with.
Yeah, that's great and very helpful. Yeah, the best piece of advice I got from one of my earlier mentors was, and this was after a project that I failed in. The project failed miserably. And he said, don't worry, you're not as bad as your worst day, but then also you're not as good as your best day, just to sort of stay even keel and kind of just move forward through the ranks. I guess, last question before we open up to Q&A. Is there a phrase or insight that has stuck with you throughout your entire career that you really latched onto and really helped you navigate the corporate mountain, that you'd like to share with everyone? And I'll share the one that rings true for me, which I talk about in the book. For me, it was have the courage to make 1 million mistakes, but the wisdom not to make the same mistake 1 million times, and really learning to be uncomfortable with making mistakes. And that took a long time because I was trying so hard to be perfect. So I don't know if there's a phrase.
The one that comes to mind really, and it's been funny to, I'm the youngest of three. My brothers are 9 and 11 years older than I am. And now I'm watching my brother parent his kids, and, he's saying to them what he used to say to me, which is really that there's a really small difference between being good and great. And it's like the little things that actually make the difference. And so I think about that all the time. Like, what are the little things we can do that can really, enhance our effectiveness, enhance the effectiveness of others, help you build trust with other people. So that's been on my mind a lot lately.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, we have 2 questions so far in the queue. So this is the first one. And it's interesting. So any advice to first-gen immigrant people of color, which I think all this can apply, but maybe there's some information specifically. If the book doesn't address it, are there other books you recommend to your parents when they first immigrated?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I've got a lot of good suggestions on that. I mean, what I can say is I would encourage them to read memoirs of other immigrants, because I think it would actually make them feel less alone. Both fiction and nonfiction, I mean, I think about, Jhumpa Lahiri's book, The Namesake, which was, I think, in part inspired by the experience of her growing up in Rhode Island as a first generation, Indian immigrant with her parents from Bengali people from India. And, the first time I read that book, I said, oh my God, there's literally a book about my parents' lives, because the commonality with these experiences was incredible. And watching it on film, it was one of the rare instances where the film was in some ways more dramatic than even the book, just because you're actually seeing your life play out. I think that, kind of looking to pieces of literature, and now as we get more and more representation on the silver screen, like watching more and more things like that, I think helps with that sense of loneliness that I think inevitably sets into people who do step away from, comfortable lives to come to this country.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that same feeling happened to me with the book Homegoing. And that's a book by a woman named Yag Yassi. And very similar. She wrote about African immigrants, so immigrants that came from Africa directly to America, and then people who were historically from America as Black. And I read that book and I was like, oh, this is about my parents. So totally get it. Great. Another, it's not sort of question, but comment, which I'll read. You can hope for an abundance mindset, but there are pretty high quotas for geography, school, ethnicity, gender at elite colleges like Harvard for the last 100 years. That said, it's worth noting that many of the pioneering women in corporate America were deemed highly unsupportive of their larger, later waves of women, just as Sachin Jain mentioned. So I definitely agree with that statement that people who were early on, the first in the corporation definitely can help pave the way for future folks. But I'm curious on your thoughts on this. I can say for me, I've had this experience, I've hired people of color, and they've been African-American or Caribbean-American or African, and I've actually realized implicitly I had a higher expectation for them to develop. And not because I was like trying to be harder on them, it was more so an internal sort of motivation that I wanted them to do well. And so sometimes that can happen implicitly. I don't know if you've experienced that as well.
Yeah, no, certainly have experienced that. And, sometimes you feel greater connection to people and you feel somewhat greater investment in their success because they may, feel familiar to you and you may project yourself onto them. So that certainly has happened. This is a relatively fresh take, something I've been thinking on for the last couple of months about like the role of elite academia, for first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants. And actually how it's not necessary after after a first or second generation. And I think it's so important, in terms of establishing social capital, because going to these places can change your life and change your world from a social capital perspective. But then if you kind of, go to like the Malcolm Gladwell concept of like, bridging capital, or the Robert Putnam concept of bridging capital, once you have someone like that in your family tree, then it confers benefits, like far-reaching benefits to people like, who don't necessarily go to elite academic institutions. And I'm watching the experience of my nephews, who are all incredibly bright, who are going to college in a time where it's much harder to get into elite schools than it once was. But I'm looking at their career outcomes because they have my brothers, they have my father, they have me kind of guiding some of their connections. They're getting jobs that, Errol, you and I never would have gotten. They're getting access to opportunities that you or I never would have gotten, and they didn't go to elite schools. It's because they have access to, more social capital. Yeah. And so I think the value and importance of these schools is actually in some ways higher, when you first are establishing a family foothold in a new country, and far less important actually later, because I think, once you have that connection and capital, it changes the game, considerably.
I see the social capital regression analysis forming to test out the theory, but I agree with the hypothesis. So I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, I mean, Errol, the difference is that you and I are going to have each other to call for our kids, when they need a summer internship. I'll say, hey, go work for Errol at Healthfirst. You'll say, hey, my kid's going to go work with Sachin at Scan. We didn't have that before. My dad had 3 or 4 people he could have called before.
Yeah.
So.
No, it makes sense. And it just speaks to why representation and diversity is so important. We all have bias. So if you have a diversity of bias, you're better off than if you have groupthink. And so I appreciate that point. We had another question that just came in. I've been to a DE&I panel, and the minority panelists' consensus recommendation was put your head down, work hard, be successful to show the company that diverse workers can do great work instead of advocate for anything. I was surprised. What is your reaction? So I'll give a first take because that is diametrically opposed from any information that's in the book. But I learned from my parents, my immigrant parents, to work hard, keep my head down, but I had to match that with other information I got from my mentor, which was make sure that you know your worth, make sure that you raise your hand to make sure that you're joining projects that are of significance and that you're navigating through mentors and also other connections of people that don't look like you. I don't know if you'd add anything, Dr. Jain.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about it is I think, this question of like, what should the conduct of minorities be in the workplace is complicated. I think their conduct should be the same as every other employee. At the same time, I do think we do have an obligation to kind of, support people in the workplace who need help navigating it, whatever color they or background they may come from. And those of us who've had different paths, to leadership, I think have a lot to offer other people. And so I think with help with that navigation, help with that mentorship is a real extra obligation, that we all bear. And, something that I personally take, pretty seriously. And it's doesn't just extend to Indians, in my world. It extends to anybody whose path or journey has been kind of more complicated or more challenging. Some people do need that extra hand, and I think we have to give it to them.
Great. I think this will be our last question, and we'll bring Bunny back for closing statements. So someone wrote, thank you for this webinar. Would Errol and Sachin be willing to share a preferred contact method, email, social media, in case we would like to discuss the content of this webinar further? So I'm happy to put my contact in the chat. Sachin, I don't know if you have a preferred method.
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably just as good as anything for me. Okay. So yeah.
Perfect. So we'll do that. I'll put it in the chat. And with that, I want to thank you because the 50 minutes have flown by. One, thank you for being part of the book. Two, thank you for joining this conversation. There's so many people who've benefited from the information in the book, and some people have reached out. I told you this personally. Man, those nuggets of truth were so great. So I just appreciate the sharing the good stuff with the book. And
no, thank you, Errol, and thank you for writing the book again. And if you haven't seen the book, it's quite a tour de force, and would just encourage you to buy it and support Errol in getting the word out.
Awesome.
Well, I would second that. And actually, I had one more question for you, Errol. How did you balance writing a book and having a full-time job and teaching and everything else you do? How was that possible?
When there's a will, there's a way. So teaching to me is an extension of my day job because I recruit 50% of my students. And I love talking about health policy with the students that take the program, which is why I end up teaching at multiple schools. The book for me was therapy during the pandemic because I was by myself for 2.5 years. After seeing COVID disproportionately impact people of color and then the murder of George Floyd, all of these thoughts were in my head. And to take the time on Saturdays was my writing day. I would go out into a park or to some coffee shop in Brooklyn, and literally 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. every Saturday, I was writing, and I do research in between. So it was therapy. And that's how I found the time.
And what's been most surprising about being a published author?
The biggest surprise was the title, because I specifically wanted a leadership book that people of color could gravitate towards, because I've read Good to Great, I've read True North, I've read all of these, you can look in the back, I've read all these leadership books, and there wasn't really a message that I felt was for me. But what I've learned, the biggest lesson I learned was the lessons in the book are for everybody. And so hindsight 2020, I hope the professionals of color doesn't divert other people from reading it, because I think anyone can read it.
I agree. I think it was fantastic. And thank you both so much. I learned a lot and actually was shaking my head on a bunch of different things. Being a woman, there are a lot of different issues there too. So anyhow, thank you both so much. Thanks to the audience for your thoughtful questions. And if you have not purchased the book yet, please, we put it in chat, go to it. It's really a fantastic book. And thank you again.